We have been discussing the subject of actual spiritual practice in Bhakti Yoga. Bhakti sadhanas during the primary stage of our life as devotees of God, as aspiring devotees of God. We heard that Bhakti scriptures classify these sadhanas or spiritual disciplines into two categories, into external and internal, known as Bahiranga sadhanas and Antaranga sadhanas. The three main Bahiranga or external sadhanas were remembrance, worshipful service, and surrender. I repeat, remembrance or Shravana, followed by worshipful service or Seva, both leading to surrender or Samarpana. And the three main Antaranga sadhanas, internal spiritual disciplines, are renunciation, knowledge, and practice. Vairagya, Jnana, and Yoga. In our last class, we made a fairly detailed study of Shravana, remembrance of God. And then we had taken up the subject of Seva or worshipful service. Seva in both its limited and wider aspects. In the limited sense, it is worshipping God in an image, in a temple. In the wider sense, it means serving God in His manifestation as this world. God in His manifestation as this world with all its living beings. With the feeling that He dwells in everything. That is important. So, this is the wider sense of Seva. Serving God in His children. That is real Seva. If I do it in this spirit, then I am doing God's work. In the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna says, by worshipping Him from whom all beings originate, and by whom the whole universe is pervaded. That means the God Himself has become everything. By worshipping Him from whom all beings originate and by whom the whole universe is pervaded. By worshipping Him through the performance of duty. So, performance of duty in that sense, that is worship, real worship. By worshipping Him through the performance of duty, does one attain perfection. That means, even duty must be performed as an act of worshipful service, not merely as duty as it is understood. I must not seek any personal gain from my work. I must regard myself only as an instrument in the fulfillment of a vaster, of a divine purpose. So that is true worship, worship in the larger sense. Today we will briefly look at some inner psychological aspects of service as worship and its place in our scheme of spiritual practice. Now, in the beginning, in the beginning we may feel some difference between work and worship, though we carry on or try to carry on both in a spirit of surrender. To feel this dichotomy between work and worship is quite natural in this state, but we try to convert that into a spiritual practice when we do it in a spirit of surrender. Then we will find that we are able to carry on this inner worship even in the midst of all duties. That is the second stage. Finally, all our work becomes a worship. In other words, we pass through these three stages: work and worship, work as worship, and work is worship. At first, whether it is spiritual practice or the performance of our duties, the truth is we do them in an egocentric way. Even our sadhana is egocentric in that stage. Then we try to make our activities as selfless as possible. How? By offering the results of our work to God. And in the last stage, we perform everything in order to please the Lord. As our heart becomes purer and purer, we begin to feel His presence. We feel that the Lord is like the operator and we are like machines. We learn to work as instruments in His hands. But that is the last stage. Then our whole life becomes a life of undivided consecration. Our whole life itself becomes a worship of the divine. That is why our elders, all our elders, I mean the great monks of our order, both past and present, they have always insisted that work and worship must go hand in hand. Both bring about the purification of our mind, and both help in the unfoldment of our higher consciousness. So, we have to look upon them as a twofold sadhana. That means it is not two separate spiritual disciplines. It is one complete, comprehensive spiritual discipline with two aspects: work and worship. But they are inseparable. They are one. They are inseparable from each other. Nobody should neglect their duties in the name of prayer and meditation. If you are able to work remembering God all the while, we may not need so much of private meditation. I'm not trying to minimize the importance of prayer and meditation, but then even Ramana Maharshi once said, "Why do you people talk so much about meditation, meditation, meditation? You must always be meditative." So what is most important is that the aspirant should always be in touch with the divine in some form or other. One of the best ways of achieving this, to constantly remain in touch with God, is to repeat the mantra mentally, even when engaged in routine work. Swami Brahmanandaji used to say, let the wheel of japa continuously turn within. Let the wheel of japa continuously turn within. This sound system, this sound symbol, this is a great help. With it, we can fill up our mind with the name of God. Then, whenever there is an opportunity for service, we should take it up. Take it up wholeheartedly. Because if we avoid those opportunities, the soul shrinks. We don't realize this, but we become more and more self-centered. And that is the very opposite of being spiritual. We need not go about seeking more work, but we should by all means render service if there is any occasion, because we grow through giving and not through receiving. But while serving, we must be detached, of course. We must be detached, but we must also be fully sympathetic. We render help wherever we can, but without attachment. Always keeping in mind that we are not the doers. Sri Ramakrishna said, serve all your relatives and friends as if they belong to you. But know in your heart of hearts that they all really belong to God. They don't belong to you. Now, practically speaking, in order to convert work into worship, first of all, we should try to create and maintain a spiritual mood with japa and meditation. When we take up a work, we can't think of God all the time. So Brahmanandaji advises that we remember Him at the beginning, in the middle, and at the end of the work. Always thinking that we are doing the work as a form of service to God in order to please Him. There is no other intention or motive. As we succeed in practicing this first step, we can remember the Lord more and more, even in the midst of work, constantly. The mind has two currents, an upper current and a lower current. The upper one we are all aware of, but we are not generally aware of the lower one, the unconscious. And usually this lower mental current is filled with useless thoughts. But this undercurrent can be trained to think of God, even as we go about our day-to-day duties. It can be trained at the same time to remember that we are working for God's sake. Remembering God and remembering why we are working. This undercurrent of the mind can be trained in both. This constant awareness, this prevents work from becoming mechanical. It also prevents the mind from being occupied with worldly thoughts. Sometimes, owing to pressure of circumstances, we have to do more work. These are unavoidable situations in everybody's life. But if the mind is properly trained, we can still find it possible to think of God even in the midst of intense activity. Though it must also be said that for this remembrance of God under pressure, for this regular discipline is necessary. The foundation is our regular spiritual exercises. Without that, we won't be able to carry this spiritual mood into the world of work. But the question is how to convince the mind that the Lord is the doer, that the Lord is the only doer. This is the more important part of work as spiritual discipline. In all that has been said until now, we are only conscious of our doership. I said even our sadhana in the beginning stages is egocentric. So how are we to make the mind believe that God is the real doer? The answer is through work and worship done in the proper spirit. We must first somehow become aware of God's presence. It's a big thing to say. As we heard last week, we should try to remember the Lord always by connecting everything that we do to Him. We should try to remember the Lord always by connecting everything that we do to Him. It takes much practice, but through practice, it is possible to be able to remember God constantly, even while our hands are busy with work. And if we are able to maintain an inward nearness to God, maintain an awareness of God's presence, then we will be able to feel His will, to feel His power working through our body and mind, and through everything in the world. I repeat, this is how to transform work into worship and be nearer to God. Regular prayer and meditation, they are most essential, but that is not enough. Something of that prayerful and meditative mood has to be continued during the time of work also. Then even the work that we do becomes an offering to God. It becomes a form of spiritual practice. It becomes a way of being in touch with God, as much effective as prayer and meditation themselves. Now, this leads to the idea of dedication. Dedication means offering body, mind, and soul to God. Dedication means praying to be an instrument in His hands for serving His cause, and along with striving for one's own salvation, Atmano Moksha. Along with Atmano Moksha, trying to promote the welfare of all, Jagadhita, because it is God Himself who has become everything. The central idea should be to love and serve God in human beings, and through that, to realize the highest goal of human life, that is, Atmano Moksha, one's own salvation. The kind of service may be different. That depends on the needs of those whom we serve, but the purpose is the same. So, together with work, we must also think of the Lord and offer all our work to Him. When does work become mechanical? Work becomes mechanical only when we forget God. And when we forget our goal of attaining Him, that is when work becomes mechanical. That is when work becomes drudgery. Then we work like machines. Work becomes mechanical only when I forget the goal of my life, when I forget that whatever I do is a means to realizing that goal of God realization. And it's no use working like a machine, it's a waste of time. But now the trouble is not so much the amount of work, but the way I do it. It is my inability to do it in a spirit of dedication to God. That is my main obstacle in doing work as a spiritual discipline. Work becomes mechanical when there is no purpose behind, when there is no spiritual purpose behind. There can't be any sense of dedication unless the goal of God realization is always kept in view. And unless this little ego is sacrificed and surrendered to the divine. Then again, this sacrificing the ego, this phrase has to be understood in the right spirit. Sacrificing the ego does not mean we have to sacrifice everything, including our spiritual aspirations and practices. That is not what sacrificing the ego means. It doesn't mean we just do what others say, right or wrong. That is not the spirit of dedication. Real dedication does not mean sacrificing the ego in the sense of killing it. When we practice surrender to God, our ego is not destroyed. It is only transmuted. The ego is transformed. My limited sense of individuality, that expands and finds a place for everybody in it. I begin to be more and more accommodative. We don't have to be afraid of this kind of sacrifice or surrender. We don't have to be afraid of being exploited. True surrender always brings with it a kind of higher wisdom, or should I say, a certain dignity that prevents other people from taking advantage of the devotee. So we don't have to be afraid of surrendering ourselves and appearing meek. If we do it properly, we can be sure that God will take care of the rest. Another important aspect of self-surrender is reliance on God. It is a great bondage to depend too much on outside help, to seek advice from others at every step. The more we turn to the guide inside, the more we turn to the God within, the freer we become. So, to place one's trust in God and then go on with the duties of life in a quiet but heroic way, which is what self-reliance in the best sense of the term means. To rely on God and go on with the duties of life in a quiet, heroic way. That is one of the marks of a person who has surrendered his ego to the divine. When we read the teachings of the great monastic disciples of Sri Ramakrishna, what they said on this subject of self-surrender, this is what we see. No spiritual seeker should become like an automaton, always waiting to be guided by someone else. Every sadhaka has to learn to acquire conscious control over their own personality. It is a spiritual responsibility. It is something that we owe to ourselves. So, as devotees, we all have to learn to acquire this control over ourselves. And through prayer, service, and surrender, try to be in tune with the divine and follow its commands. That is another aspect of self-surrender. So, my individual consciousness, that has to unite with the divine consciousness. My individual will has to become one with the divine will. In fact, many advanced seekers have even felt that their body is a part of the cosmic body. Such souls can never become mechanical. On the contrary, they lead a cosmocentric life, while we lead mostly an egocentric life. We are still trying to rise above our egocentricity. Therefore, whatever the nature of our duties, let us think that we are doing everything as a form of service to the Lord who dwells within us and in everybody. Any good, honest, especially selfless work, however small or humble, it becomes a form of service to the Lord when it is performed with this awareness and detachment. So that is what I wanted to say about service or work as worship of the Lord. Finally, now, after remembrance, smarana and seva, service, we come to the last of the three bahiranga sadhanas, external means. That is surrender, samarpana. And here, once again, we need to return to the Bhakti Yoga chapter of the Bhagavad Gita. If you remember, we went through these verses also last week. There Krishna first says, those who have fixed their minds on me and who, ever steadfast and endowed with supreme faith, worship me, them I hold to be perfect in yoga. That is what he says in the beginning of his reply to Arjuna's question as to who is a greater yogi, a jnani or a bhakta. Then he adds, those who meditate on me with single-minded consecration, to them whose minds are thus absorbed in me, I become the savior from the ocean of samsara. Therefore, fix your mind on me alone Rest your thought on me alone, and in me alone you will live hereafter. Of this there is no doubt. Then he scales the requirements down. He says, if you are unable to fix the mind steadily on me, then seek to reach me by the yoga of constant practice. And if you are incapable of constant practice, then devote yourself to my service. For even by rendering service to me, you will attain perfection. If you are unable to fix the mind steadily on me, then seek to reach me by the yoga of constant practice, that is, Abhyasa Yoga. And then, if you are incapable of constant practice, then devote yourself to my service at least. Because even by giving service to me, you will attain perfection. But finally he says, if you are unable to do even this, then be self-controlled. Be self-controlled. There is no compromise there. Be self-controlled, surrender the fruit of all your action, and take refuge in me. Most of you know the story of Girish Chandra Ghosh, that great devotee of Sri Ramakrishna. For those who don't know, his is a story that gives hope to the hopeless, faith to the faithless. It's a glowing example of two things. It's a glowing example of the redeeming power of God's grace. And it is also an equally glowing example of the transforming power of surrendering to God. An example of the transforming power of surrender to God. Before he met Sri Ramakrishna, Girish had led a reckless, pleasure-seeking life. He was a self-proclaimed libertine. Ein selbsternannter Wüstling auf Deutsch. He called himself a rebel against God. But certain events that happened in his life, both inner and outer, they brought him to Sri Ramakrishna. And one day, in the course of conversation, Sri Ramakrishna said to Girish that along with his work, which he could not give up, along with his work, he must remember God at least in the morning and evening. He didn't expect anything more. Just remember God in the morning and once in the evening. He looked at Girish as if expecting a reply. And Girish thought that was a simple thing to do. But he was a busy man with no fixed hours even for eating or sleeping. Just like many of us in the modern world, no fixed hours even for eating or sleeping. So Girish would surely forget to remember God at fixed times. How could he promise that? Sri Ramakrishna read his mind and said, all right, if you can't do that, remember God before meals and when you go to bed. Before meals and when you go to bed. But Girish was not willing to promise even that. His life was so irregular. Not only that, he was by nature opposed to any hard and fast rule. The slightest constraint, the slightest restriction was irritating to him. Sri Ramakrishna saw this and he finally said, so you are unwilling to agree even to this much? All right, then give me your power of attorney. Befullmächtigung. Give me your power of attorney. From now on, let me assume responsibility for you. You don't have to do anything. As he said these words, Sri Ramakrishna was in one of his exalted moods. And Girish was greatly relieved. This was just what he wanted. He thought he was saved and he was free as air. But he didn't see that he had given up his freedom, that he had made himself Sri Ramakrishna's captive. He could not see that he had to give up all personal initiative and submit himself to his Guru's will in everything. His only thought was that his teacher had taken entire charge of him. Then Sri Ramakrishna began to train his devotee according to this new attitude. Even in very small matters, Girish was not allowed to say, I will do this. Sri Ramakrishna would correct him. He had to say, God willing, I will do it. This is how the devotee was taught to give up all ideas of personal responsibility and become a willing instrument of the divine. Naturally, as a result, his mind constantly began to dwell on Sri Ramakrishna. This is what samarpana is. This kind of surrender to the divine is in itself a mighty form of sadhana. It's not as easy as we might think. What we generally can do is pray to God and depend upon Him as much as we can, whenever we can. What we can do is try to offer our body, mind and soul at the feet of our Ishtadevata, the chosen deity, repeatedly, again and again. In the Gita we read, the Lord dwells in the hearts of all beings and by His Maya causes them to revolve as though mounted on a machine. It's a very famous verse. The Lord dwells in the hearts of all beings and by His Maya causes them to revolve as though mounted on a machine. Just as puppets are moved by the puppeteer from behind the screen, in the same way we are moved and made to act on the world stage under the control of the Lord who is seated in our hearts, unknown to ourselves. Take refuge in Him alone with all your soul, Krishna says. Take refuge in Him alone with all your soul. That is, give up self-conceit. Stop feeling yourself too important. Because everyone, whether they know it or not, is under the control of the Supreme Lord. By His grace, you will attain supreme peace and the eternal abode. By His grace, you will attain the supreme peace and the eternal abode. Thus has the profoundest wisdom been declared by me. Reflect upon it fully and act as you will. Reflect upon it fully and act as you will. We are told what we should do and what we should avoid doing. But it is entirely up to us to choose the right and reject the wrong. These are Krishna's words at the very end of his teaching in the Gita. When we draw ourselves away from God, that is when we become more egocentric. And the more egocentric we are, the more blunders we commit, and we fall from the higher path. But instead of taking our stand on the ego, if we surrender ourselves to God, make Him, not our little selves, make Him as the center of our consciousness, then spiritual life is not so difficult. Sooner or later, we will find some power coming and lifting us up. If one practices complete self-surrender, Sri Ramakrishna says, one cannot take any wrong step. Because God will have taken up His responsibility. It won't do just to say, I left everything to God and then go and do as we please. A person who is attached to the objects of this world, to their own desires, to their own prejudices, such people can't even think of surrender. Without a certain minimum of detachment not only from the external world, also from one's own desires and prejudices, as I said. Without this minimum of detachment, self-surrender is impossible. And for complete self-surrender, complete detachment is necessary. From a spiritual point of view, it is good to be under great uncertainty. It is good if everything we relied on is snatched away from us. If we are left without any worldly support, it is good if all old values, all old friendships, attachments are broken. And we find all that we had clung to disappear. It is good that all forms of external consolation, all hopes in other people crumble. Then we will be forced to turn to God. Then we will realize that God alone has been and is our eternal and only true friend and guide. The experience is very painful. But for many of us who want to be bhaktas, it is very necessary. Otherwise, we forget God and we forget our spiritual destiny. We don't know anything about our future. We can't rely on perishable things, but that is what we do. Sometimes the treatment is more painful than the disease, but we have to undergo it. The worse the disease, the stronger the treatment. But just as there is a treatment, just as there is a cure for every disease, this is also a step leading to perfect cure. Egotism is our disease. Pain and suffering is the treatment. And self-surrender to God is the cure. The Lord sends His devotees miseries and hardships, makes them suffer, makes them pass through ordeals. Why? So that they may come to their senses, so that they may wake up. But Maya is so powerful that we forget all our past sufferings and go on in the same old ways. So we need something to remind us constantly of God. There is a beautiful prayer in the Bhagavata. Kunti Devi, the mother of the Pandavas, she prays to Krishna, O teacher of the world, may calamities befall us on all sides. May calamities befall us on all sides, for it is dangers that make it possible for us to have your vision. It is dangers that make it possible for us to have your vision, which puts an end to the cycle of rebirths. It's a very well-known prayer. So, uncertainty and hardship is not all bad. Let us not make a blueprint and a Blaupause. Let's not make a blueprint of our life. It doesn't mean we should not have a general plan. Of course, we plan for our future in a general way, but we must also leave everything to the Lord. Let Him make us do what He likes. What else can we do anyway? I said, we don't know what will happen tomorrow. So what can we do but take things as they come and try to do our best? Whether we know it or not, whether we acknowledge it or not, our past, present, and future rest in God's hands. So the best thing for us to do is play our part as well as we can and surrender ourselves to Him as much as possible. Try to feel His presence. Try to surrender our will to His and be at peace. That brings strength to the heart, and sooner or later it will certainly bring a new light to the heart also. We may all be spiritual aspirants, but we too quite often neglect or forget God's grace. There are occasions, plenty of occasions, when we become overconfident in our own strengths and become careless. Sometimes this even leads to arrogance. There is a funny story in our old books. Once there was a little mouse in a hermitage, in the hermitage of a sage. One day a cat fell upon it, and the sage took pity on it. The mouse. The sage took pity on the mouse and transformed it into a cat. Then a dog chased this new cat, and so the sage changed it to a dog. Then this poor dog was attacked by a leopard, because the hermitage was, of course, in the forest. The dog was attacked by a leopard, and so the sage transformed it into a tiger. But when the little mouse became a tiger, it wanted to devour the sage himself. Then the sage said, "All right, just be the old mouse again." Something similar happens in our case too. God showers His grace on me, which purifies me to a certain extent and enables me to enjoy a certain amount of freedom. But then I become egotistic. I begin to think too highly of myself. I become careless. Or I go to the extent of abusing others or reforming the world. Then suddenly the grace is withdrawn and I find myself alone, facing a terrible inner void. So let us bear in mind that those who really and truly follow the spiritual path are less egocentric and more selfless, kind and considerate to others. The less the ego, the greater the joy and peace. This is everybody's experience. And as Swami Vivekananda says, the less the ego, the better our work. So let us not think lightly of our spiritual blessings. We need not keep brooding over our weaknesses, our past mistakes, but we also need to develop some alertness of mind. Constant alertness and a sense of discrimination, they are essential even in the path of devotion and surrender. Otherwise, we won't be able to understand, we won't be able to profit from the blessings God is showering on us. Sri Ramakrishna has said that if you walk one step towards God, He comes to you 10 steps. But in order to see the truth of these words, we will have to surrender to Him fully. Until we do that, we won't know the important role God is already playing in our spiritual lives in the background. But a little more of this in our next class. We have already reached the end of our time today.